Good afternoon and welcome to our LinkedIn Live. I'm Margaret Sherer, Head of Marketing here at MIRACL. Today joined by Correy Voo, our Chairman with extensive experiences. And what we want to talk about today is actually what is the real costs of passwords. Before we get all into that, Correy, do you mind doing a little bit of an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Quick 30-second summary. I've been in IT for probably 35 years or so, in various roles, most recently in CTO, CIO roles in some fairly major banks around the world, Bank of America, UBS, etc. Prior to that, in large IT companies and telecommunication businesses worldwide.
So you are quite used to talking about technology as it evolves and kind of as we take old processes and renew them into our modern day.
Yeah, it's part and parcel of what I've had to do as a business and as kind of business leader, making transformational changes and investment cases for fairly senior managers, etc.
Perfect. So I think you're well equipped to cover our discussion today, which is going to look at, the true cost of passwords. There's a couple of data points that always get passed around quite easily, but we really want to go into why are passwords so expensive? Why are we spending so much time on this outdated technology that actually comes with quite a bit of sunk costs? And when it doesn't have to be that way. So as an introduction, I was hoping that you could give us a little bit of a brief history of authentication, namely password systems that are so widely accepted today, but yet really don't meet our modern technology capabilities or expectations.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what most people consider to be the birthplace of cybersecurity, etc., started in the kind of late 70s, 60s, 70s type era when computational systems started becoming more popular, becoming more widespread. Passwords were always thought of as the first part of a solution towards securing systems, but in those days we didn't really know very much about the threats of security and various other things. So it was always thought of as the default solution for a long, long time, and still is for a lot of people. However, the world has moved on, and the solution is no longer the only solution, or no longer is it relevant in a lot of cases. A lot of modern cybersecurity requirements actually require us to be much more flexible, a lot more adaptable for these kind of things, and basic password solutions are no longer fit for purpose.
So can you elaborate that a bit more? Talk about some of the projects you've been on where passwords have really gotten in the way, both in time, in terms of like time it's taken to log in, added frustration, and then we'll get to real costs afterwards.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I won't go into obviously specific details for confidentiality reasons, but in a lot of cases in the past where I've worked, password systems and in general security systems have been based on designs, theories, and ideas and concepts that were first generated a long time ago. It's taken a lot of recent changes in the cybersecurity world for those theories to be superseded by new ideas and new concepts. Cybersecurity and access controls are always about allowing people to access a service or gain access to a particular function. And if it doesn't happen in a fast, efficient, quick way, you're effectively limiting the amount of performance that a user or a business can perform.
And
A
so in
couple of
terms,
examples.
yeah,
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say a couple of examples I can give you is a long time ago I worked in a bank where the authentication and access control systems in that business were should have been replaced a long time ago and were earmarked to be replaced. But for one particular example, one particular set of systems took anything from 11 minutes or so to log in and then 11 minutes or so to log out, simply because of the complexity of those systems. So if you imagine that as a total amount of time wasted on a given day for everybody in the business, that's 22 minutes roughly per day for every employee in that business. That isn't productive, right? And that's something that you cannot have in modern businesses.
And in that scenario, we're talking a bit about in the enterprise, and those time that you had on it, that's a successful day. Nothing went wrong in your login process. It's just that's how long it took
Yeah.
to make it. So if you can imagine any failure to get into it, or what we talk about the login success rate, can you go into a little bit further, like what are the real costs that you've seen for password resets and that poor login success rate?
Yeah, sure. The concept of login success rate is actually a fairly modern concept, actually. Um, in the early days when security systems were designed, it was all about stopping people getting into systems. But actually, what we talk about today is access control rather than access prevention.
Okay.
And when you're talking about access control, login failure rates, the percentage of success for logins, even how many times you log in actually equates to and calculates and quantifies towards the actual operational cost of providing that security system. The idea of an authentication and access control system is to allow you safely to enter into that system and to control, essentially what you do in that system. It isn't necessarily there to stop you getting into the system, every single time you try to log in, or actually prevent you logging in. So the complexity of those systems becomes an issue. If you take a look at a lot of studies that have been done in the past, the average cost of a single password reset call to the support desk ranges from anywhere from $55 to about $150. The
Wow.
top end I've seen is about $257 per single call. Obviously, that relates to the complexity of the business and the complexity of the systems that you're applying those security systems to. But even if you take the medium numbers, let's say we take $70 as an average, you then say, let's take a company of 100,000 employees or customers, more importantly, logins per month, and then you look at passwords alone, and you say, okay, well, let's say 10% of those actually result in a failure. Not everybody's going to report those failures, but let's assume that 25% of those failures are reported to the help desk. You're talking an average of $175,000 equated cost per those reset calls. That is a substantial amount of money for anybody to equate to.
And that's like, per month and just on that support system. It's not even necessarily talking about any of the other costs that go into running your passwords. And then, then we talk about, you kind of wonder, why are companies tolerating these kind of sunk costs when the password alone is not fit for purpose, but we're still using it, as you say, as a default. But then how do you equate this cost when you then add in multi-factor authentication and what most, again, in a default multi-factor authentication environment, people are using like SMS? How does that then even add more, dare I say, failure and costs?
Sure. As I said before, security systems and a lot of the paradigms that we use in security today were designed a long time ago and were waiting for a long time to be updated. They are now being updated. So modern security paradigms require a lot more flexibility, a lot more adaptability, and a lot more precision in what they do. So you can't apply the traditional hammer rule to everything, right? You should not apply a single solution that covers every single environment, because those kind of solutions typically don't exist in a lot of cases, because users have different needs and consumers in particular are learning more about those environments. So in your example, if you take a look at a complex solution of any kind that supports, say, an online website or a retail site, gambling site, something similar, most people are resorting to, again, multi-factor solutions. They're resorting to encryption. But if you take a look at multi-factor of SMS, for example, not only are you increasing the cost of those support functions, you're also increasing the cost of the systems themselves. You need SMS support tools, you need SMS transmission tools. The phones need to be capable of receiving SMS. And then inherently within the SMS system itself, you've got a lot of risk, because SMS itself isn't a guaranteed transmission protocol. There's no guarantee that the SMS will be received or transmitted. And the data sent by an SMS is actually clear text. So anybody who has access to your SMS system is capable of reading that information. So again, what I tend to advise people today is look at the solution that you're trying to secure for and find a solution that best fits that requirement.
Okay. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of real costs of service, the SMS costs themselves, calls to help desk, potential losses if people can't get through the door. We were talking about real costs. There's obviously the potential costs, right, as far as in a real time cost for people. But equally, if somebody, I kind of always say, nobody goes to your website or your app to log in. That's not part of it shouldn't be really part of the experience. And if you remember it taking so long, then you're also risking kind of your brand trust and longevity of opportunity with those customers. So I'm curious, with all of this in mind and the complexity that's being offered in the marketplace, how can companies rethink authentication and claim back these sunk support costs?
The simplest answer is just by simplifying and being more precise and clearer about what you're trying to protect, and then applying a solution that actually meets the functional criteria of that requirement.
Mm.
Again, using a sledgehammer to solve this, to bang a single hammer into a piece of wood isn't the solution for every single situation.
Okay.
Today's solutions, such as MIRACL, for example, provide a lot more simplicity and a lot more speed and performance, specifically suited to things like online use or kind of temporal usage and those kind of things, where if the user really wants to get into an environment, that's what they go there to do. As you said, users don't go to a retail site or a bank site, etc., for the purposes of enjoying the privilege of logging in. They don't do that for that reason. They go there to do a particular function. They go there to do a job. That job is either to go and buy something, to go and place a bet, to go and do some banking, maybe even to find out what's going on, to view media content, etc., etc. The login process is a function that should not prevent people getting into those systems in a very complicated way. They should protect as much as necessary, and the requirement for that protection is appropriate to the amount of systems that needs to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
MIRACL in particular has a lot of speed in what it does, and the system has the capability of logging in within 2 seconds. It's as secure as many other solutions out there, but it has a particular number of facets that provide a lot more capabilities for specifically online use and other kind of lightweight use cases.
So, that all makes sense to me. I'm very biased in the situation, but I like hearing all of the data as far as what the true costs are, and saying going for, in your previous example, of 11 minutes just to log in as part of your daily routine compared to 2 seconds with MIRACL. I'm going to invite actually our CCO, Michael Tanaka, now to kind of show what can we think a good and simplified MIRACL solution and login looks like, and then we're going to discuss a little bit more of some of the costs and comparative to what we spoke about before. So hi, Michael.
Hi there. Hi, Margaret.
Welcome. So do you mind just showing, what does MIRACL look like? What is a pretty fast log and go?
Yeah, this is going to be probably one of the fastest demos you've ever seen. So as we've mentioned, it's usually around a 2-second process. You hit login, type in your PIN, and the whole thing's done. And this can be integrated to pretty much any sort of cloud-based service. We also have various different IAM products and SSOs, which can also be take advantage of this authentication. But I'll just slow it down really quickly. So logging in, you see the ID has already been established in the browser here. You can actually switch to other IDs, and you have a PIN which is for that particular ID, in this case, demo@miracle.com. So the only user action is they just need to type in 4 numbers and they're straight in. And that's in equivalency to something like username, password coupled with an SMS OTP, which usually takes around 30 seconds. And actually, funnily enough, we found that with pretty much most of the organizations we're working with, the average they talk about is around 30 seconds, whether they're using an authenticator app, whether they're using an SMS OTP or whatever. Pretty much everybody's happy to say 30 seconds, which means we're saving 28 seconds each time.
Okay, so that's a lot of time savings right off the bat. Can you also walk us through, the potential costs of our system and compared to what we've been talking about as just a password alone, or in the previous example, Correy discussing, say taking 100,000 logins a month, for example.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously your costs come from a number of different places, and there's actually a lot more subtlety to what I'm going to present here. I'm just going to hit some of the main things, but probably one of the biggest one that we're looking at, we've already mentioned, is obviously the time spent, because that's a really easy one that you can actually measure per authentication. And let's say in the case of a 1,000-person enterprise logging in 5 times per day, believe it or not, that would equate to about 4 man-years saved per year, or about 300 pounds per person every year saved by using our system over, let's say, any other 30-second process. The other thing which is really going to make a big difference, which Correy talked about before, is the success rate. Our success rates are basically almost unbelievable when you look at them. On a B2C engagement, which is almost always going to be the hardest thing, which low frequency authentications, we're hitting as high as 99.87%. On a B2E, where it's pretty much the employee, so you could think of that as sort of an SSO or equivalent, might be somewhere around, in our highs around 99.93, or in other words, a 0.07% failure rate. And on B2B, where you have agents hitting this thing again and again and again to authenticate an action, such as a transaction, we've hit as high as 99.997%. So that was 2 failures in 77,000 events by 1,500 agents.
Wow.
You also have direct costs as well. I mean, one of the things I find quite funny is when people talk about passwords, they always assume that they're free. And of course, they're not. Passwords are basically reliant on an infrastructure. They're reliant on people maintaining that infrastructure. And in a lot of cases, they're not done actually properly. So you have people who are poorly trained managing and maintaining these systems, which are basically the gateway to your systems and your services. They are most definitely not free. The thing is, a lot of people have just forgotten about those costs. I don't have any real good numbers in that one. I'm sure we could probably come up with some stuff if we dig a little bit deeper. You also have things like that cost of support, which of course goes back to that success rate. So if I can take your failure rate down from say 10% to say 0.13 or 0.2%, that's going to be a huge savings in the number of people who are going to have to hit that support desk. And whether you're going low end of $55 that Corey's talking about, the high end, whatever it is, it's going to be a massive savings. And then the one other thing which got to be mentioned as well, we are supplying a secure authentication technology here, which means that we're going to be reducing the account takeovers. Things like credential spraying, which is credential stuffing, I should say, credential stuffing attack, where you're taking known credentials stolen from another service and hitting your service to try and assume that the users use the same credentials. Those sort of attacks, password spraying, phishing attacks, none of those attacks will work against our technology. So what that means is you don't have to worry about the sort of remediation of these account takeovers. There's a lot of staff time taken, and it's not just the time taken to remediate the issue, the direct issue. You've also got to investigate why it happened, and perhaps if it goes further than just the account that was taken over. So you hear some numbers, we're talking about millions of dollars for any sort of takeovers. Generally, maybe not an account takeover, but certainly for a breach. And if you can reduce those account takeovers and the breaches, you're going to reduce those costs significantly.
And with that, just curious, is that something that we find businesses are having to add into their budgets, like the oh no budget, if you will, just in case these kind of hacks are, I was going to say something else, if those kind of things happen. So that is kind of, you could imagine that's a reallocation of funds into something that hopefully drives your business forward a bit more.
I don't know about that, but what we definitely have seen is a lot more interest in things like cyber risk insurance. And I think a lot of people are sort of saying, oh, I get my cyber risk insurance and then I'm covered. The unfortunate part about it, it's an insurer, and the insurers aren't going to pay out unless they have to. So as an example, we heard of one particular case where they had to attest that all their systems were secured with multi-factor, but they were relying on Microsoft's conditional access, which meant that it decided not to do a multi-factor in one particular case, which then breached some of the systems, being the emails, and then basically from that, the attack occurred. So guess what? The insurance company decided not to pay out. The only way the company could have avoided that is they had to get a much higher level of a license with Microsoft to be able to control the conditional access, to force multi-factor at every step, which they didn't have.
Okay, so so these costs are just to summarize, we're saying simply alone being able to take your login success rate from say 90% with passwords alone. In a second, I'm going to ask about SMS, but we're kind of assuming maybe 80% success rate, just all the way up to 99% plus. We also are saying that in scenarios with MIRACL, if there is a failure, somebody forgot their PIN and needs to reset, most of the time they're able to, in that very rare instance, or you said 2 failures out of 70,000 plus, those people were able to recover, reset themselves without even a help desk call. But can you talk a little bit more about our pricing model as compared to people using SMS as a multi-factor authentication second step?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, again, when you're looking at our pricing model, What we have to understand is that we are pretty much providing the entirety of that authentication framework. If you're comparing again SMS, oftentimes people, what they'll do is just look at the SMS costs. And even if you look at it versus the SMS costs alone and exclude all the other infrastructure, because you still generally have the credential base or the username password stuff, you still have everything else, which takes basically generates these OTPs and obviously then consumes them as well. Even if you exclude that, just look at the SMS cost, we're typically from a quarter to a 20th the cost of the SMS text, especially if you're looking in Western Europe, where sometimes it can be as high as around 20 cents in some areas, and certainly parts of, let's say, Africa as an example. So our costs are generally around 1 cent per use on low volumes, and as low as say 0.3 of a cent per use on high volumes, and that's the entirety of it. So there's no additional license fees, there's no bandwidth fees or registration fees or anything like that. It's all down to that usage. So very straightforward.
So, you know, we can say this is bold, that essentially our solution alone could see a reduction of, what are we saying, 99%, 98% of current just support costs alone?
Yeah, if you're using some, it depends upon, obviously there's a lot of parameters to that sort of estimate, right? But if you're using sort of mid-rate things for the failure rates for username, passwords coupled with an SMS OTP, if you're using, let's say, a support ticket cost of around $70, and if you're using something pretty fair number for us, a failure rate of around 0.2, then what you're looking at is a cost reduction based off of just the support costs mostly. Of around 98 to 99%.
So some people might say that this is too good to be true. Some of our clients have said that, and that they thought that it was so good to be true, meaning a multi-factor authentication that's easy for the consumer to use, gives so much cost back to the organization. How can you reassure those that might be skeptical?
Well, you know what, obviously, probably one of the best assurances is being able to speak to some of our customers, which obviously we can arrange to the parties that are interested. But really, a lot of this is pretty obvious when you get to think about it, because what we've done is almost straightforward and basically so simple. It's sort of like, why hasn't somebody done it before? What we're doing is we're stripping out all the extra steps to the authentication. We're making it a single step process. So that means the user just types in that PIN. That's really important because every extra step is another source of failure from a user perspective. Also, every extra device you have to bring into play or network or other sort of technology is also a point of failure as well. So if you think of something really simple as, let's say, having to have a mobile phone when you authenticate in a browser, Google found in 2019 that 38% of users don't have a mobile phone present. And that includes, it's in the car, it's in my jacket pocket, it may be turned off, maybe it doesn't have charge. So when you start off with those sort of problems, you can sort of understand then why there's a really high failure rate with almost every other form of strong authentication, whereas ours is tied directly to the channel that you're receiving the cloud service in. If it's a native app, we're integrated directly with native app. If it's a browser, we're delivered directly from the same browser you're actually receiving that service from. So it means that there won't be any chance that it won't be available at the time you need it.
Amazing. So thank you both for this. This is really helpful. I don't believe there's any questions that we have from the field. Correy or Michael, do you have any kind of last thoughts, or you're both good?
Nothing particular. Obviously, if anybody would like to contact us and try it out, we can obviously give both demos, but also set up some trials and POCs if required.
Amazing. So yep, so you can see below, if you get in touch with us at miracle.com, info@miracle.com for email or other questions. Reach out. Thank you everyone for your time today, and we'll see you next time.